Story 1. Footprints. Drying beside a cold hearth. The storm had been trailing me all afternoon, a low bruise of cloud moving across the ridges as I wound along the Blue Ridge Parkway. The air had that wet metallic edge to it, the kind you can smell before rain breaks open. I wasn't in any rush. The road was quiet, the leaves a churn of orange and rust, and the mountains seemed to fold endlessly into each other. Then the sky dropped lower, the wind came in hard from the left, and the first fat drops smacked against the windshield with the heaviness of something that intended to stay a while. My wipers squealed and skipped, the glass smeared with water. The next pull-off came with a narrow service road disappearing into the trees. It was nothing more than two muddy ruts with a strip of grass between, but it looked like a place to get off the main road until the weather settled. I eased the car down, tires splashing through shallow puddles, until the track ended in a small clearing. At the far edge, partly swallowed by the slope and a tangle of rhododendron, was a cabin leaning into itself. The porch sagged like it was tired of holding its own weight. One step was missing entirely, leaving a shin-high gap. The handrail was gone. I hopped up and caught the frame of the door with one hand. The door gave way easily, no lock, no creak, just a soft push, and I was inside. The air was colder than it should have been, still in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like a jar of pennies opened after years. The room was simple, a hearth on the far wall, two small windows clouded with grime, a table with one leg propped on a stack of old magazines, and a chair with splintered rungs. Rain whispered through gaps in the roof, tapping into the dust and scattered dots. That's when I saw the footprints. Two sets, side by side, pressed deep into the dust from the doorway toward the hearth. The tread was worn, the center smooth as if the boots had been walked in for years. The prints stopped a couple of feet from the stone, ending at a small bare patch of floorboards. The wood there was cleaner, lighter in color, as if someone had stood there for so long that dust refused to settle. I crouched down and hovered my hand above the patch. It felt colder here, though I told myself it was just the draft coming from somewhere unseen. I glanced back toward the doorway, half expecting to see fresh prints leading out, but there were none. Only mine, and these two worn sets leading inward. The hearth was empty, no stacked wood, no ashes, just a grate filmed with old soot. I brushed it with my fingertips. Cold. That faint, metallic scent seemed stronger here. I turned my head slightly and caught a sound. Soft, irregular, like fabric shifting against wood. It came from behind the hearth. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon sheltering under the floor. Still, my eyes went to the baseboard where the prints ended. One of the boards had a small hole where a nail had been. I pressed against it, and it flexed ever so slightly. The scrape came again. A pause, then a slow, careful breath that wasn't mine. The wind pushed against the walls, making the whole cabin give a low groan. I stood there, trying to think of something sensible to do. The idea of opening that board fought with the idea of leaving it alone. In the end, I stepped back. Some things in the mountains aren't yours to uncover. I moved to the window. The clearing outside was smaller than I'd thought, the rhododendron crowding closer. My car sat in the mud with water puddling around the tires. The service road was turning to muck, and I knew if I tried to leave now, I might get stuck. I stayed put, keeping my back against the wall where I could see both the door and the hearth. The scrape came once more, slower this time, followed by 3 soft taps on the stone. I waited, my breath shallow. Nothing followed. The rain lessened after a while. But the clearing looked dark, the trees heavier. I decided to leave anyway. I took a step toward the door, then stopped. Through the window, between the slick leaves of the rhododendron, I saw movement, a figure stepping out. They were thin, wearing a faded camo jacket and old boots. The boots, even from here, looked like they'd leave prints with a worn, flat center. The person didn't hurry. They walked to the porch, glanced at me through the open door, then looked past me into the cabin. "You don't want to be in there," they said. Their voice was low, like someone unused to speaking. "I was just waiting out the storm," I said. My own voice sounded too loud. They didn't answer, just stepped inside. They walked to the clean patch of boards and stood there, hands in pockets, eyes on the hearth, their shoulders lowered slightly, like in resignation. "We're done," they murmured, not looking at me. No scrape, no breath, just silence that seemed heavier than the storm outside. The person stayed like that for a moment, then turned, walked back past me, and stepped off the porch into the wet clearing. They didn't look back. I left soon after. The road was slick, the tires slipping once before finding their grip. When I reached the parkway, the clouds were breaking, letting in bruised yellow light. I drove on, not looking in the rear view. That night, in a cheap motel, the air conditioner rattling, I could still smell damp wood and metal. I thought of the clean patch by the hearth, the breath under the floor, and the worn boots stepping neatly into the prints that had been there before. I didn't sleep much. Some places hold on to whoever comes through them, others, they're holding on to something else entirely. Story 2. The table set for nobody. The fog that afternoon had a weight to it, the kind that makes the air feel thick in your throat. I'd been walking the trail for hours, the world around me shrinking until I could barely see more than 30 feet ahead. The trees looked more like silhouettes than living things, their trunks fading into the white. I wasn't planning on leaving the path, but a darker shape appeared in the mist, off to the right, maybe 20 or 30 yards in. Curiosity pulled me closer. As I stepped off the trail, my boots sank into damp leaves, and the smell of wet earth deepened. The shape became a cabin, small, weathered and sunken a little into one side, as though the ground was giving way beneath it. The windows were streaked with grime, the roof patched with mismatched tin sheets. The door was closed but unlatched, a sliver of darkness showing between it and the frame. I stepped up onto the porch, the boards sighing under my weight. No padlock, no obvious signs anyone had been here recently. When I pushed the door, it swung inward without a sound, letting in a thin beam of fog. The air inside was cool, smelling faintly of dust and old wood. Light spilled in through the cracks between warped boards, making thin stripes on the floor. Dust floated through those beams like slow-moving snow. The whole place seemed empty. Bare walls, no shelves. No piles of old clothes or blankets that you sometimes find in forgotten shacks. But then my eyes caught the table. It was in the center of the room, 4 chairs around it, and it was set. 4 plates, 4 cups, and a pot in the middle with a spoon resting inside. The plates were spotless, not just wiped but polished, reflecting the thin light from the window. The cups were dry, not a ring of water or a stain in sight. The pot's lid was slightly off-center, as if someone had set it down mid-meal. The chairs weren't neatly tucked in. They were pushed back just enough, each one angled slightly away from the table, as if 4 people had stood up at the same time and stepped back. I stood in the doorway staring, my fingers still on the doorframe. At first, I thought maybe someone was living here, a squatter who kept things clean, but there was no smell of food, no lingering warmth in the air, no signs of recent fire in the small stove in the corner. I stepped closer, my boots leaving shallow impressions in the thin layer of dust on the floor. There were no other footprints, just mine now, moving toward that table. I looked into the pot. It was empty, bone, dry. No residue, no crumbs, nothing to suggest it had ever been filled. The spoon inside was clean enough, to reflect my own distorted face back at me. I called out, half expecting someone to answer from another room. "Hello?" My voice came back to me, faint and dull, as if the cabin had swallowed most of it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt shaped, deliberate, like the place was holding its breath. I let my eyes wander to the corners, the walls, the ceiling. The boards overhead were warped from years of moisture, and through the gaps I could see slices of white sky. Still, no movement, no sound beyond my own breathing. I ran my hand over the back of one chair. The wood was smooth, the edge slightly warm from the filtered light coming in, but there was something about the way it was positioned that unsettled me. It wasn't just pushed back, it was turned subtly, as though whoever had been sitting there wanted to keep one eye on the rest of the room. I checked the others, all angled differently, none facing straight back toward the table. It was like they'd all risen suddenly, but not in the same direction. The longer I stood there, the more it felt wrong to be inside. My heartbeat sounded loud in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just an abandoned cabin someone had once used for a meal, and they'd left it behind in a hurry. But there was no dust on the plates or cups. Everything else in the room was coated in it. That meant someone had been here. Recently. I backed away from the table, careful to step where I'd already walked, and moved toward the door. The air outside was somehow heavier than when I'd gone in, the fog pressing close, muting the color of the trees. I shut the door behind me, though I didn't know why. As I stepped off the porch, I glanced once more through the grimy window. The table sat there unchanged, the set of it neat but waiting, as if the owners had just stepped out for a moment. I made my way back to the trail, trying to shake off the unease. My boots squelched in the damp leaves, and the forest felt too still. By the time I reached the main path again, the fog had thickened, turning the trail ahead into a tunnel of pale grey. I pushed on, wanting as much distance between me and that cabin as possible before the light started to fade. It was nearly sunset when I stopped to drink from my canteen. The forest around me had taken on that dim, blue shade it gets before night settles. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I caught the faintest smell of wood smoke. It was thin, almost imagined, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I listened hard, and under the soft hush of wind in the trees, I thought I heard something else. The faint clink of metal on ceramic, like a spoon against a cup. I turned toward the sound, peering through the tangle of trees, but the fog blurred everything into shapes without meaning. My mind jumped to the image of those 4 chairs, all pushed back in different directions. I told myself it was nothing, just a sound carrying strangely in the mist. But I didn't linger. I walked faster, resisting the urge to look over my shoulder, though I could almost feel the weight of something pacing me in the distance. By the time I reached the edge of the woods near where I'd parked earlier that morning, night had fully arrived. The moonlight filtered weakly through the fog, casting everything in silver. My car was cold to the touch, the windshield beaded with moisture. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting my breathing steady, but that faint smell of smoke was still there, curling in through the vents. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. When I pulled onto the road, I kept the windows shut and the headlights low. The forest slid by in pale, shifting shapes. Every so often, I thought I caught a flicker of movement between the trunks, a figure keeping pace, always too far away to see clearly. I told myself it was the fog playing tricks. But when I stopped at a gas station an hour later, stepping out into the bright light, I caught something in the air. It was faint, almost drowned by the smell of fuel and asphalt, but it was there, the metallic clink of dishes being set down and the whisper of chairs being drawn back across a wooden floor. Story 3. The lantern that burned all night. The hike had been meant as nothing more than a half-day wander, just a loop to clear my head before the weather came in. But the sky had been restless all morning, the clouds dragging low over the ridges, turning the tree line into a shifting wall of shadow. The air had that charged stillness to it, the kind that makes you notice how quiet the birds have gotten. By the time the first drops started spitting through the canopy, I'd already decided I needed shelter. The map I carried was years out of date, and the trail markers had gone from scarce to non-existent. I cut down a deer path, hoping it might connect to one of the old service roads, but instead it delivered me into a small hollow where the ground was soft and dark with fallen needles. That's where I saw the cabin. It leaned slightly to one side, the roof sagging inward where a whole section of shingles had collapsed. Half the structure looked like it had been gnawed on by wind and rain for decades, the boards warped and silvered. The front steps were long gone, replaced by a pile of mossy stone blocks that might once have been part of a chimney. A door still hung there, crooked on its hinges but somehow intact, and when I shouldered it open, the smell of old wood and wet air rolled out. Inside, it was one open room. The light came through the holes in the roof. Dust floating in slow spirals in the beams. In one corner, a rusted wood stove sat with its pipe bent like a broken neck. Opposite it was a workbench with jars full of dark, unrecognizable things. And near the far wall, tucked in a shadow that the daylight didn't seem to reach, stood the lantern. It was the kind of thing my grandfather would have kept in his shed. Painted metal pitted with rust, glass cracked in 2 places. The wick inside was blackened to nothing, as if it had been burned out long ago. I bent down and touched it with the back of my fingers. It was cool, dead metal. There was no fuel smell, no weight of oil in the base. I set my pack near the wall opposite it and unrolled my sleeping bag on a stretch of floor that looked the least likely to collapse. The rain started not long after I'd settled in, first in soft taps through the gaps in the roof, then in heavier drips that thudded onto the floorboards. The smell of wet pine seeped into the cabin. I dozed on and off, listening to the storm deepen. At some point, I must have slept harder than I meant to, because the next thing I remember is waking in the dark. The storm was still going, wind pressing against the gaps in the walls, but there was light in the cabin. It was the lantern. The glow was soft and steady. A warm yellow that made the air between me and it feel thicker, almost solid. It wasn't the kind of uneven flicker you get from a candle or a fire. This light was full, reaching into corners I hadn't been able to see earlier, drawing shapes out of the shadows. The jars on the workbench gleamed with liquid I could now tell was clear. The wood stove shone like it had been polished. Even the warped boards under my sleeping bag looked smoother, their grain catching the light like calm water. I didn't move at first. Something about the way it swayed, just slightly, as though on a hook in a breeze I couldn't feel, made me stay still. My sleeping bag felt heavier than it should, as if the air had settled onto me. I told myself the light could be explained. Maybe someone had been by recently. Maybe the wick wasn't as dead as I thought. Maybe there was a hidden fuel source. But the longer I lay there, the more I realized the light wasn't acting like it came from inside the lantern. It felt as though it was seeping through it, like the lantern was a window for something behind it. The sway grew more pronounced, enough that the edges of its shadow on the wall thickened and thinned in a slow rhythm. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. I couldn't tell if it was moving toward me or just rocking in place. But the light kept growing warmer, filling the room until I couldn't find a single shadow left. The broken roof above me should have been black, but it was glowing faintly like moonlight on snow. At some point, my eyes closed again. I don't remember deciding to sleep, but I woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the holes in the roof. The lantern was where it had been. Unlit, glass cracked, cold to the touch when I reached for it. The air was damp and smelled of rain and rot. For a long moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it, if the light had been nothing but the flicker of a dream shaping itself into the cabin's corners. I packed quickly, rolling my sleeping bag tight and slinging my pack over my shoulder. I stepped outside into a world scrubbed clean by the storm. The air was cool, the ground soft. As I walked away, I glanced back at the cabin, and that's when I saw it. The window above where the lantern had stood was broken, just jagged edges of glass clinging to the frame. But in its pane was a faint reflection, a round, yellow glow, steady and warm, exactly where the lantern would be inside. The rest of the window reflected only the pale sky and the trees, but that one shard held the light like it was still burning in there. I stood in the clearing longer than I should have, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the sun catching the glass. But the fog in the trees was thick, and no beam of sunlight could have cut into the cabin at that angle. Eventually, I turned and started back toward the trail, the image of that stubborn little glow following me. Every so often, I'd look over my shoulder. I never saw anyone in the clearing, but more than once between the trees, I thought I caught a flicker, just enough to make me feel like the lantern wasn't done with me yet. Story 4. The Locked Room with No Door. I'd been walking most of the afternoon, following a service road that didn't seem to lead anywhere. The gravel had long since been swallowed by moss and pine needles, and in places, the trees leaned so close together it felt like they were pushing me along a tunnel. I'd expected it to open out to a clearing or a hunting shack, but instead it just dwindled into nothing, the tire tracks disappearing under a carpet of needles. I was about to turn back when I caught sight of a roof line through the branches. It sat low against the slope, like it had been set there decades ago, and the forest had simply grown up around it. The cabin looked worse the closer I got. Boards warped and silvered, the roof patched with mismatched shingles, one corner sunk deeper into the ground. The porch sagged, the handrail splintered, and the door hung slightly crooked in its frame. I stepped up carefully, testing each board with my weight before moving on. When I pushed the door, it swung open with a sigh, letting out a wave of air that smelled like damp wood and something faintly sour, the way basements do when no one's been in them for years. The inside was one open room. The floor was bare except for a few piles of leaves and pine needles that had blown in through gaps in the walls. A stone hearth sat cold against the far side, and beside it, a workbench leaned at an angle, one leg shorter than the rest. The light was thin, filtering in through the two small windows that weren't boarded over. My eyes followed the walls, tracing the seams between boards, until I noticed something strange along the right-hand side. That wall was different from the others. The planks looked newer, their color richer, their grain still visible under the dust. In the middle of it was a small window, no bigger than a bathroom vent, boarded over with fresh-cut pine. The boards didn't match the rest of the cabin. They were straighter, less weathered, the nails still showing bright in places. I stepped closer, my boots clicking against the floor. The air here felt heavier, almost warm compared to the draft that came in everywhere else. I don't know what made me do it, but I pressed my ear to the boards. For a second, I heard nothing except my own breathing and the creak of the wood under my stance. Then it came, faint, steady, rhythmic, breathing, slow, like someone deep in sleep. I held my breath to be sure it wasn't just an echo of my own, but it stayed, rising and falling on the other side. I leaned back and looked over the wall again. There was no door, no hinge marks, no sign there had ever been an opening. Just a solid run of planks from floor to ceiling, broken only by that boarded-up window. I rapped my knuckles lightly against it. The sound was dull, not hollow, but not the same as the rest of the walls either. The breathing didn't change. The warmth in the air felt wrong now, like standing too close to a heater you can't turn off. My mind flipped through explanations. Maybe there was a second room built onto the cabin from the outside. Maybe it was an old storage space. Maybe the breathing was an animal trapped in there. But it didn't sound like an animal. It had that human steadiness, that almost imperceptible pause between inhale and exhale. I backed away without touching the boards again, suddenly aware of how quiet the rest of the cabin was. No wind in the gaps, no settling noises, just the muted beat of that breathing. My boots felt too loud as I crossed back to the door. The light outside looked different now, dimmer even though it couldn't have been more than mid-afternoon. I stepped out onto the porch and didn't look back through the doorway. The service road seemed narrower on the walk back. The trees pressed in, their branches low enough to brush against my shoulders. The air was cooler away from the cabin, and I didn't realize how much tension I'd been holding until my jaw started to ache. By the time I reached my car at the end of the trail, I'd already decided not to tell anyone about it. I couldn't explain it without sounding like I'd imagined the whole thing, and I wasn't sure I wanted anyone else to know it was there. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the sound again. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon nesting in a closed-off crawl space. But sometime after midnight, I woke to the faint sensation of not being alone. The room was dark, but my ears caught it. That same slow, steady breathing, impossibly close, as if it were coming from just beyond my bedroom wall. I held still, my eyes on the ceiling, telling myself it was the house settling, the wind through the siding. The breathing didn't stop. For the next few nights, it came back. Always the same rhythm, always in the same place. No matter which way I turned in bed, I checked the walls, the vents, every corner of the room in daylight. Nothing, no signs of animals, no drafts that could explain it. I've stopped trying to figure it out. I don't go near the cabin anymore, but the sound hasn't left me. Some nights it's faint enough that I can almost pretend it's gone. Other nights it's so close I can feel the air shift with each breath. I keep wondering if something in that locked room followed me home, or if I was never really outside it to begin with. The journal that ended mid-sentence. The rain had been stalking me since early afternoon, a low haze on the ridges that thickened into something heavier the deeper I went into the trail. By the time the first real drops fell, I'd already passed the point where turning back made sense. My jacket was doing little more than holding the cold against me, and my boots squelched with every step. The map I had was no help. Half the landmarks were from another decade, and I was just scanning the tree line for anything that might pass as shelter when I saw it. The cabin was tucked low against the slope, its roofline barely breaking the curtain of rain. No smoke, no sign of upkeep, but it looked intact enough to keep me dry. The porch sagged, boards swollen from years of damp, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. It gave with almost no push, swinging inward into a single-room interior that smelled of wet earth and rot. There was nothing inside but a table, a chair tipped on its side, and a book. Not a big book, more like a ledger or an old trapper's journal, thin and spotted with black mold along the edges. It lay open on the table, the paper warped but still readable. I set my pack down and thumbed back to the first page. The handwriting was neat at first, tight loops and steady lines. It read like a diary meant for no one else's eyes. Notes about weather patterns, days spent checking trap lines, the rare mention of a passing hiker or trader. I sat in the tipped chair after writing it, the wood creaking under my weight. The rain drummed overhead, pooling on the warped floorboards before seeping through the cracks. I kept reading. Weeks passed in the journal with nothing more than talk of game being scarce or a fox taking hens from a coop somewhere down the ridge. Then the entries began to space out, the handwriting getting looser. There were mentions of hearing things at night, scrapes under the floor, the sound of dirt shifting. At first, the writer blamed animals. But the tone shifted. The words got shorter, less patient. The last page was different. The pen strokes shook, the ink heavier where the point had lingered too long. It read, "It's here again tonight. Louder now, heavier. I can hear it moving under me slow, like it knows I'm awake. I think it's right under me now and I..." The sentence ended there, cut off by a jagged slash of ink that trailed down toward the bottom margin. I glanced at the floor under the table. The dirt there was darker, almost damp, and in the center was an impression, a palm shape pressed from below. Not deep, just enough to make the fingers and curve of the thumb visible. My eyes stayed on it longer than I meant to. The shape didn't look old. A shiver crawled up my neck, though the air inside was warmer than outside. I pushed the journal closed and slid it back where I'd found it. The rain had picked up again, hammering against the roof hard enough to drown out everything else. But as I sat there, I felt a faint tremor through the legs of the chair, like something shifting in the ground beneath me. I told myself it was runoff, water loosening the soil under the foundation. Still, I found myself moving the chair back, farther from that dark patch of dirt. The light through the small window had gone grey-blue with the evening, and I knew I'd have to either stay the night or make the wet walk back to the trailhead in the dark. I was weighing both options when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to rain or wind. It was a slow drag, like a heavy hand brushing against the underside of the floorboards. The boards creaked once, directly beneath where the table stood. I froze, leaning forward to listen. The sound came again, a steady pull and stop, pull and stop. The handprint in the dirt seemed darker now, edges crisper. I backed toward the door without taking my eyes off it. The wind slammed the side of the cabin, rattling the frame, but the drag beneath the floor didn't falter. I stepped onto the porch and pulled the door closed. The rain felt almost warm against my face, but my hands were numb on the straps of my pack. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the slope, and even then all I could see in the window was my own reflection, pale and uncertain in the stormlight. That night, in my own bed, the sound followed me. I woke to a faint creak under the floorboards and the steady rhythm of something dragging just out of sight. Each time I looked toward the corner of my room, I swore the shadows on the floor were bent around the shape of a hand, pressed up from underneath. The mirror facing the woods. The day I found the mirror, I hadn't meant to be that deep off the Blue Ridge Parkway. I was following a deer path that looked like it might cut down to an old fire road, the kind that loses its gravel to moss and lets the woods swallow it an inch at a time. But the path curled behind a stand of hemlock and simply kept going, narrower and darker, like an animal's idea of a hallway. The air had that soaked blanket heaviness it gets before rain. And the forest had gone quiet in the way that warns you the weather is already standing in the next valley. I kept telling myself I'd turn back at the next bend, but every bend offered another one, and I was stubborn or stupid enough to keep walking. When I first saw the shack, I thought it was just a shadow put there by two trees leaning too close, but then the shape held after the light shifted, and the straight lines of it gave the lie away. It sat low on a bit of high ground, like a box someone had set down and forgotten, its roof pitched wrong, tin sheets held in place by rocks and an old tire. One window faced the trees. No door opened onto the side I could see, just that square of blackness with something dull and pale leaning in it. I climbed up the little rise slow, testing the ground with my heel because around here, ground can decide not to be ground anymore. I expected to smell animals. the old sour of nesting or damp fur. But what I smelled was old wood baked empty, and the faint iron taste of rain coming, like a penny sucked dry. The window had boards above and below it that had long ago lost their paint, and in the gap between them someone had propped a mirror, the kind you'd find leaned behind a dresser in a bedroom that never kept heat, framed in scarred wood with a split running one corner to the other. The glass wasn't clean. A cloudiness lived inside it, like breath trapped and dried long ago, with streaks that refused to be wiped away by time. It shouldn't have shown much of anything, especially not with the light broken up by hemlock shade, but when I stepped close, the mirror gave back a smear of me standing there. A pale oval of face, dark jacket, hat brim, the trees behind me smudged into a watercolor of greens. I frowned at myself the way you do when you expect less and get more, then leaned a little to the left to see if the mirror's angle was fixed. That's when I saw the shape. It stood further back than I ought to have seen it, as if the mirror had borrowed distance from somewhere else. It wasn't a trick of double reflection. The angle was wrong for that, and anyway the only glass around was the mirror itself. The figure was human the way a scarecrow is human from the road. Vertical, a suggestion of shoulders dark where the face should be. One edge of it ragged in a way that looked like a sleeve torn on a blackberry cane. I turned fast, an old fight or flight habit misfiring, and the only things behind me were trees arranged the way I've seen them all my life. My heartbeat shifted into the part of my throat that thinks it remembers old prayers. I forced my eyes to slow down, to name each thing. Hemlock, deadfall, a boulder with lichen the color of a bruise, the slope falling away into fern-choked understory. No person, no deer. The wind was too small to move anything heavier than a spiderweb. I looked back at the mirror because not looking felt more dangerous. My own reflection wasn't there now. The cloudy glass held only trees, sharper than they were to my eyes, like the mirror had chosen a better day to borrow from, and the figure, closer by a step you could measure with your shoulders. It stood where I should have been standing in that picture, occupying my absence. I took a half step back without meaning to, heel rolling on a root, and the mirror's trees remained perfectly still, as if wind didn't exist in that pane. The figure's edges were cleaner now, not a coat exactly. Something layered, oilcloth maybe, or a heavy shirt with the nap worn thin, a dark cap low on the head. Hands I couldn't see because they hung under the frame's bottom edge. I told myself I'd been looking into a bright patch of sky, and my eyes were making ghosts out of contrast. I told myself a lot of sensible things while my body told me to be elsewhere. I circled the shack to find the door, because whatever game this was, it would end if I could see the backside of that window. The ground on the far side fell away into a ditch where a spring had once run, leaving black mud the color of coffee grounds and the faintest line of moisture that would become a trickle if the rain ever bothered to start. No door there either, just a wall patched in 3 places with tin that had once been blue. I came around the other way, found the entry. The door was shut but not latched, and a length of baling twine hung from a nail where a lock should have been, its cut end melted black like it had seen the mouth of a lighter. I put my hand on the wood and felt no temperature at all, the kind of neutrality that says a place has decided not to belong to any season. Inside, the air had been waiting a long time. The cabin's single room held a cot with its springs exposed like ribs, a wood stove with a stovepipe that opened its mouth to the rafters and then stopped, a table with one leg propped on a Bible thickened by damp, and the backs of planks that made the wall with the mirror. Light bled in at the seams enough to make out dust like grey snow on every surface. I crossed to the wall, pressed my ear to the wood out of a habit I didn't know I had, and heard only the inside of me. No rats, no bees, no breath. There was a gap between two planks at the level of my shoulder that let me peek behind the mirror. I expected board or bracing, but there was nothing except the glass and the thin sliver of the outside world it showed. I could see the forest through that crack, not as it was from where I stood, but as a stranger might see it from a step behind me. I could also see the figure, close enough now that the edge of its jaw should have resolved into humanity if there had been anything to resolve. An ache lived behind my teeth. I pulled back, wiped my eyes with the heel of my hand because sometimes your brain throws grit into them when it refuses a picture. When I looked again, the crack only showed trees. I should have left then. Instead, my feet went to the table like they had instructions written for them, and my hand found the Bible because weight is a comfort when nothing else is. The cover peeled away from the paper when I lifted it, and the room decided to breathe my breath again. Inside the front were a few lines, names scrawled in pencil. A child's hand attempting block letters. A year that could have been 1989 or 1939, depending on whether the writer meant to close the loop. The second page gave me a grocery list that included salt meat, lamp oil, lye, and a drawing of a fish with teeth it didn't need. Under the book, cut into the tabletop with a pocket knife, someone had carved a sentence and then tried to sand it back to oblivion. The wood fibers had been torn the wrong direction and kept the words like a scar keeps a story. Don't turn your back to the woods. The wind outside found a new way to move and put a sound under the eaves like a person thinking about saying a word. I set the Bible down and listened for my heart to stop auditioning for a faster job. You learn, living up here, that fear has two kinds, the kind that sharpens you for the climb, and the kind that makes you miss the snake you're about to put your hand on. I told myself the mirror had been left there by a hunter who wanted a look at what came to the clearing when he wasn't there. I told myself reflection was superstition and always had been. I told myself to go. The mirror had other ideas. When I stepped back to the doorway and looked across the room at the window, the glass held a view of the trees lit from a direction that didn't exist, and between two bowls stood the figure, centered and patient. The closer I got to the door, the nearer it seemed in that false world, like distance measured itself by my intention. I stepped onto the lit doorstep of the threshold, breathing the outside again, and the mirror refused to give me back to myself. No face, no jacket, just the forest, waiting the way a pond waits when it isn't sure what you've thrown into it. I took 3 steps backward down the slope, because I believe in not giving your back to something that insists it doesn't see you. The hemlocks made their soft sea sound above me. A nuthatch called once and then changed its mind. The figure stood behind me in the glass. And then my heel found a dip, and I steadied myself with a hand against a stump that gave under my touch, as if it had been waiting to do that very thing. When I lifted my palm, the rotten wood came away in a round patch, exposing ants, white and furious, who boiled in a circle with the fury of disturbed choir boys. Their movement made a sound like static in the close air. I laughed on a breath because the ordinary sometimes saves you from the extraordinary. By the time I looked back at the mirror, the figure had taken 1 step more. It was enough to see what wasn't there. No face to be read, no eyes to accuse, no mouth to forgive. The head's front was the color of bark and the texture of someone who had decided against mirrors a long time ago. You can talk yourself into a lot if you decide not to say the worst words out loud. I told myself a man could smear ash on his face to keep from being seen by deer. I told myself old photographs made people look like they had no eyes because exposures are liars. The mirror's glass made no sound. Why would it? But the silence around it sharpened into the shape of one, The way you hear a tone right after the machine is switched off. When the rain finally arrived, it came soft, as if the sky had been persuaded rather than bullied. The first drops hit the roof tin in a rhythm that would have soothed me if the rest of it hadn't existed. The mirror accepted water without changing. The drops on its surface in my world failed to appear in its. I could have walked away then and been a person who tells a stranger in line at a diner about a weird little shack with a mirror doing tricks in the woods. Instead, I called out because there are rules about politeness where I'm from, even when the other party doesn't have a face to return it with. "I'm leaving," I said, like the woods were an apartment I'd been borrowing. "I'm leaving and I don't want trouble." There wasn't an answer, but the world did a small thing it shouldn't have. The mirror brightened in its own peculiar way, and I felt the space between my shoulder blades go tight, the way it does when you believe you've been noticed by something whose opinion you'd rather not have. The figure remained centered, as if it had always belonged more to that square than to the trees it pretended. I took the hint my body gave me and turned against the rule on the table, because sometimes rules are there to make you run faster when you finally break them. I moved down the slope, put distance between me and the shack by the old trick of counting steps to a number that meant nothing and then picking a new one. I didn't look back. The forest doesn't need you to look for it to watch you. The deer path reappeared, less sure of itself now that the rain had started, and I followed it until the sound of the creek came in on my left, fat with the day's water. By the time I found the parkway again, the sky had committed to grey, and cars went past with the relieved hiss of tires that have found pavement after miles of gravel. I got into mine and dried my hands on a rag that lives under the seat for oil checks and bad ideas. My face in the rear view belonged to somebody else for half a second, just the way light changes you, then settled into being my own again. And I laughed at the smallness of it all because laughter is a tool. I slept that night with the blinds shut in a room that knows my shape. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sensation of a room that was wrong by a degree that matters. No sound came through the window that faces the mountain, not even the distant truck whine or a barred owl's punctuation, but I smelled wet wood and that thin iron again, as if rain had climbed the stairs and sat politely in the corner. I stayed still with my eyes closed because children know something about monsters adults forget. If you don't look, it isn't polite to arrive. My heart made enough noise that if anyone had been in the house, they would have told me to be quiet. Sleep took me the way sleep does a person who lost an argument and pretends he intended it. The next morning, walking to the truck, I saw the kind of thing you build a story out of if you want one. On the window of the spare room, nobody sleeps there, nobody breathes on that glass. There was a fogged oval, as if a face had leaned in from the outside during the night. Not a print exactly, not the cartoon smear of a nose and two eyes, just the memory of warmth in the cold. I touched it and found the glass colder under that spot than above or below, as if whatever had visited had taken heat rather than left it. I told myself condensation happens in patterns even a weatherman would shrug at. I told myself more lies. For 3 days after, the mirror travelled with me the way a song does that you don't like but can't shake. I caught myself turning to glassy things, shop windows, the metal of a coffee urn, the chrome of a bumper, to check whether the world behind me was the one I was walking through. At work, I faced the wall more than my keyboard. At the grocery, I watched my reflection lose me in the freezer doors and then hurry to catch up. That third night, my phone buzzed on the table with a message from a number that belonged to a cousin, lost to pills and the river for 5 years. Are you there? I stared until the screen went dark because I didn't need to see my face superimposed over the words. The second buzz came without letters, just a photograph shaped wrong for the camera app, wider than long, as if it had been taken by a flat square of glass that knew nothing about phones. It showed trees I could name by their bark, and a square of sky my own rooftop hides from me. And in the middle of it all, too close now to call it anything else, the figure whose edges didn't learn from light. I turned the phone face down and carried it to the sink like it was making noise I couldn't hear. I didn't throw it away. We never throw away our machines, we just ask them to wait out our fear. Sleep came like it had been told to behave. When I woke, the house had mislaid a degree of itself. The hallway felt longer, the corners sharper. I walked out onto the porch that faces the mountain and saw not the mountain but a flatness for a moment, a plain where distance refused to layer itself the way it always has. The feeling passed so quickly I might have blamed the cheap coffee if I hadn't then noticed the sheen on the window facing the yard. It was the shine a mirror has when it wants attention, even if the thing shining is not a mirror, but the same old pane of glass I've washed 100 times. I've gone back toward that stretch of the parkway twice since the day with the shack. Each time I told myself I was going to a different trailhead, that I wasn't doing the thing I was doing. Both times the weather changed the way it did before, a dampness that finds your bones first and tells them a story about weight. And both times I turned around before the deer path could pretend to be a road. The second time I passed a man walking the shoulder, hat brimmed down, jacket too thin for the air, and when I checked my side mirror to give him a careful berth, it didn't show him at all. It showed the trees as if I were parked in them. I looked back over my shoulder like somebody's grandmother and saw the road the way it should be, and the man turning his head slightly as if listening to a thing I couldn't hear. It occurs to me now that the mirror in the shack wasn't meant to show whoever stood in front of it. It faced the woods, not the room. It faced what the people who lived there couldn't keep from watching. Maybe it was a trap, or a warning, or a confession. Maybe it was a window into a version of the forest that keeps better records than ours. I know what I saw, which is to say, I know what the seeing made me into. A person who does not turn his back to glass that insists on its own opinions. A person who chooses the lane away from tree shadow, even when the sun says, "Don't worry." When rain is on the way, the mountain smells like old pennies and needles. On those days, the mirrors in my house do a small, rude thing. They slow down. Move your hand and you'll watch it arrive a fraction late in the silver. Blink, and the you behind the glass is polite enough to wait for your eyelids to finish their work before catching up. It's the kind of thing you can live with if you decide to, like a knee that doesn't bend in weather, or a dog that barks at a corner you've always trusted. I keep the blinds drawn on the side that faces the woods now. Not because I believe that will help, but because doing nothing feels like an invitation. If you ask me for a lesson, the way folks do when they want a story to be worth more than itself, I'd give you the one that was carved into that table and then tried to be erased. Don't turn your back to the woods. That's true, whether or not you've got a mirror to enforce it. And if someday you're walking a deer path that decides it's more than a path, and the light in the trees goes flat like a lake under a sky that forgot how to be a sky, and you find a shack with a window that holds a glass that doesn't agree with you about what's there, remember this: reflections are not promises. They are negotiations. Some of them are made by ponds, some by chrome, and some by a piece of wood-framed glass that has learned to keep what looks into it. I keep to the main road now. Not because the forest means me harm, I don't think it does, but because there are rooms out there that have learned to face outward, and I've already given mine more of my shape than I meant to. The stove that wouldn't cool down the trail I'd been following had faded to little more than a deer path, and my legs ached from pushing through brush that didn't want to let me pass. I'd been hiking since late morning, trying to reach an old fire road I'd seen marked on a map from the 70s, but the ridges in this part of the mountains had a way of making distances lie. By the time the sun began dropping behind the high peaks, the air had taken on that sharp, brittle cold that seeps in early during the fall. I was still miles from where I'd planned to set up camp when I spotted the cabin. It was newer than most I'd stumbled across out here. The roof was intact, the boards still a strong brown instead of the sun-bleached grey you usually see, and the windows hadn't yet sagged in their frames. No smoke, no tracks in the mud leading up to it, just a silent square shape in the middle of the clearing. I was tired enough not to think too hard about why a cabin like that would be sitting empty. I crossed the clearing, boots squelching in the cold, damp earth, and mounted the porch. The door wasn't locked. Inside was bare except for a wood-burning stove in the middle of the room, blackened with soot. Its pipe stretched straight up through the roof, and the iron body was streaked with dull orange where rust had started to creep. I set my pack down by the wall and walked toward it, figuring I'd check if there were any logs or scrap wood nearby to make a fire. I brushed my fingers across the lid without thinking. The heat hit instantly. I jerked my hand back and sucked in a breath. It wasn't warm like metal that's been sitting in sunlight. It was the deep, searing heat of something that had been burning for hours. But when I leaned down and opened the hatch, the inside was dark. No glow, no smolder, not even ash in the pan beneath. The grate was spotless. The heat had no reason to be there, yet it throbbed from the iron like a heartbeat. The air outside had been near freezing. So I told myself the stove must have absorbed heat from earlier in the day, maybe from some trick of the sun on the roof, though the cabin had been in shadow when I'd arrived. I didn't like how weak that explanation sounded in my head. I stayed just long enough to take the edge off the cold before deciding I'd pitch my tent in the tree line instead of sleeping inside. Something about the place didn't sit right, and I've learned to trust that feeling. That night, the cold came in heavy. I was curled in my bag, my breath turning to frost in the beam of my headlamp when I heard it. Faint at first, just a hollow clank somewhere in the distance. I lay still, listening. The sound came again. A metallic ring followed by a dull thud, over and over in a rhythm like someone lifting the stove lid and letting it drop. The cabin wasn't far. I could see the faint outline of its roof against the darker trees when I poked my head out of the tent. The sound carried on, steady and patient, as if whoever was making it wasn't in any rush. It was too cold for anyone to be out there without a fire, and the idea of some stranger standing in that empty cabin, feeding a stove that didn't burn, made the hair on my arms stand on end. I zipped the tent shut and tried to ignore it, but the noise didn't stop. The clanging went on for what felt like hours, with only the occasional pause, as if waiting for something that never came. At some point, I must have dozed, because the next thing I remember is waking in the dark silence just before dawn. The air in the tent was warmer than it had been, though my sleeping bag had slipped off my shoulders in the night. When I stepped outside, the clearing was quiet. No smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. The ground around it was undisturbed, no prints in the frost. Still, when I passed the open doorway and glanced inside, the stove stood there, a faint shimmer in the air above it. I didn't touch it this time. I didn't need to. I could feel the heat rolling off it from where I stood. I left without looking back, but for days afterward, I'd wake in the middle of the night, certain I could hear the dull clang of iron somewhere in the distance, the sound of a stove lid opening and closing, waiting for someone to feed it.